He set his dogs on her like prey, convinced no one would ever question his badge. But when Danielle Carter fought back, bleeding on the grass with the world watching, the truth could no longer be buried. What began as a morning jog would ignite a battle that threatened to tear an entire city apart. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The park was still half asleep when Danielle Carter laced her shoes and pulled her jacket tight against the cool air. Greenwood Park stretched wide under the pale light of dawn, a sanctuary of trees and winding trails just minutes from her house. This was her ritual. Every morning before the city stirred, before her phone lit up with case files and urgent calls from the bureau, she ran. Running was her escape, her way of emptying the weight of the FBI badge that hung heavy on her life. Each stride was a cleansing rhythm, each breath pulling her further away from the constant images of crime scenes and interrogation rooms that haunted her mind. She loved the quiet most of all, the grass wet with dew, the first rays of sunlight brushing against the tree line, the faint chorus of birdsong. For a brief moment, the world seemed balanced, as if all the ugliness she confronted daily could not reach her here. Greenwood Park was her cathedral, the only place where she could feel unshackled. But beneath that peace, there was always an undercurrent she could never fully shake. Greenwood was not just a park. It sat on the edge of a town where racial hostility had lingered for generations. Danielle knew the history because she had lived it. Her parents had endured slurs. Her brothers had been pulled over for no reason more times than they could count. Even she, an FBI agent, a woman trained to hold her ground, had tasted the suspicion, the narrowed eyes, the quiet hostility that followed her when she walked into certain stores or restaurants. She carried herself with dignity, but she also carried a constant awareness. Some people in this town would never see her as equal. That morning, she tried to let it go. The trail curved along a small pond where the mist rose in thin sheets, making the air cool against her face. She picked up her pace, her muscles warming, her lungs filling with crisp air. She thought about her caseload, about a fraud investigation she had been leading, but let the thoughts drift away as her body settled into rhythm. She passed the familiar bench where an elderly man often read his newspaper, though at this early hour it sat empty. A pair of ducks skittered across the water, their sudden movement startling her before she laughed it off. Danielle didn't know that this morning would be unlike any other. She didn't know that someone was waiting for her on that trail, watching with cold calculation. She didn't know that in less than an hour, blood would stain the grass of Greenwood Park and her name would be hurled across the headlines of the nation. What she did feel, faint but growing, was a prickle along the back of her neck. A sense that the quiet was too fragile, that the balance she cherished was about to crack. She slowed her pace for a moment, listening. The rustle of leaves, the splash of water, the faintest echo of footsteps, not her own. She kept moving. The first time she saw him, he was standing in the middle of the trail as if he owned it. A tall, broad man with a squared jaw, a sheriff's deputy uniform stretched across his chest, and two hulking German shepherds at his side. His hand gripped their leashes tight, though the dogs strained forward, growling low in their throats as Danielle approached. Deputy Raymond Callahan. She recognized the name, though she had never crossed paths with him directly. He had a reputation, whispered even among law enforcement circles, quick to anger, proud of his badge, known for running the K-9 unit like it was his private army. And there was another reputation too, less official but just as true. His disdain for people who looked like her. The trail narrowed where he stood, making it impossible to pass without walking close to the dogs. Danielle slowed her pace, her breath even, her face calm. She would not let him see fear. "Morning, deputy," she said, her voice steady. He didn't return the greeting, his lips curled into a smirk, his eyes cold. "Park's closed for your kind." The words landed heavy, sharp enough to slice through the morning air. For a moment, Danielle thought she must have misheard, but the hatred in his tone made it undeniable. She inhaled slowly, forcing herself not to react with the anger rising in her chest. "It's a public park. I run here every morning." Callahan chuckled, a low, ugly sound. Not anymore. He gave the leashes a slight jerk, making the dogs bark and snap their jaws. The sound echoed down the trail, violent and sudden, shattering the morning's calm. Danielle's hand brushed the edge of her jacket where her service weapon rested. She didn't reach for it, not yet. She wanted no escalation. But the sight of those animals, their teeth glinting, made her pulse quicken. "I'm just finishing my run," she said. "I'll be out of the park in 10 minutes." He tilted his head, studying her, savoring the way her composure masked the flicker of unease. Then he stepped aside, pulling the dogs back just enough to let her pass. His smile lingered. "Don't run too far. I'll be seeing you again." Danielle walked past him, her eyes forward, every muscle tight. She could feel his stare burning into her back as she jogged ahead. The dogs barked once more before the sound faded behind her. She told herself to shake it off, that he was just another bitter man drunk on power. But deep down, she knew better. That encounter hadn't been chance. The way he stood on the trail, waiting. The way he spoke, not to warn her, but to threaten. He wasn't done with her. The dread lingered, gnawing at the edges of her calm. She kept running, the trail winding deeper into the trees, every step carrying her closer to the moment when the trap would spring. It happened so fast she almost didn't have time to react. She rounded a bend in the trail, the trees thick on either side, when Callahan appeared again, this time ahead of her. He must have cut across the park to intercept her. His presence was no coincidence. He had been waiting, planning, choosing this moment. The dogs were louder now, growling viciously, their bodies tense with coiled aggression. Callahan's grip on the leashes looked deliberate, loose enough that Danielle could see how little control he intended to keep. Her heart pounded, not with the steady rhythm of running, but with the sharp thrum of danger. "You just don't listen, do you?" His voice carried through the trees, mocking and cold. "I told you, this park ain't for you." Danielle stopped, her breathing heavy, her eyes locked on his. She had handled armed suspects, broken criminal rings, stared down men with more power than Callahan could ever dream of. But the hatred radiating from him, the simmering rage just beneath the surface, was different. This wasn't about law or order. This was personal. "Deputy, let me pass," she said firmly. "You don't want to do this." But he wanted exactly this. His jaw tightened. He took a deliberate step forward. The dogs lunged, teeth snapping, claws digging into the dirt as they strained against their leashes. The sound was feral, primal, vibrating through the quiet morning until the forest itself seemed to recoil. Danielle backed up a step, her hand instinctively resting on her holster. She didn't want to draw, didn't want to make a wrong move that would justify the violence in his mind, but she also knew she was outmatched. 2 trained attack dogs. A deputy who had already decided she was prey. And then, without warning, Callahan loosened his grip. The leashes slackened. Rex and Duke lunged with explosive force. Pain tore through her arm as teeth sank deep into flesh. Another set of jaws clamped onto her leg, dragging her down. The world spun, the grass and dirt filling her vision as she screamed, the sound raw and desperate, echoing across the park. The dogs pulled, thrashed, their growls mixing with her cries. The sharp sting of ripped muscle, the warm rush of blood, every sensation crashed over her in violent waves. She fought back, clawing at the ground, striking with her free hand. Her fingers closed around a fallen branch, thick and jagged. She swung wildly, slamming it against one dog's head. It yelped, but didn't let go. The other bit harder, tearing deeper into her leg. Her vision blurred with pain, but her training screamed at her to survive, to live. With trembling fingers, she reached for her Glock, drawing it from its holster even as the dogs dragged her down. She fired once, the shot cracking through the morning, the recoil jolting her body. Callahan staggered back, clutching his thigh where the bullet tore through. He roared, a sound of rage more than pain. The dogs yelped, startled by the blast, loosening their grip just enough for her to push herself free. She collapsed to one knee, blood dripping down her arm and leg, her chest heaving. And then she heard it. Sirens. Growing louder, closer. Callahan stood, bleeding but not defeated, his face twisted in fury. The dogs whimpered at his side, restless and confused. Behind them, a new voice cut through the chaos. Calm, almost chilling. "It's already live," the young man said, phone held high recording. "You can't stop it." Danielle turned her head just enough to see him. Ethan Walsh, a local with a reputation for live-streaming police encounters. His camera lens glinted in the rising sun, already broadcasting the carnage to anyone who cared to watch. The park, once her sanctuary, had become a battlefield, and the whole world was about to see it. The wail of sirens drew closer until flashing lights bathed the trees in red and blue. Squad cars tore down the service road, tires spitting gravel, doors flying open before the engines had even cooled. Within seconds, the trail was swarmed. Officers spilled into the clearing, hands on their weapons, shouting commands that blurred together. "On the ground," one barked. "Drop the gun," another screamed. Danielle froze, her chest heaving, blood streaking down her arm and leg. The Glock still rested in her trembling hand, muzzle angled toward the dirt. Every instinct told her to comply, to stay calm, but the chaos pressed in like a storm. Callahan seized the moment. Staggering forward, clutching his thigh where blood soaked through his uniform, he pointed at her with venom in his eyes. "She attacked me!" he roared, his voice cracking with pain and rage. "She sicked herself on my dogs, then shot me." The words sliced through the air, sharp and commanding, and for a heartbeat the officers seemed to believe him. Their guns stayed trained on Danielle, their boots stomped closer, kicking up dust. Danielle's pulse thundered in her ears. Her voice came low but firm. "I'm a federal agent." With her free hand, she reached into her jacket, pulling out the black leather case that bore her badge. The gold letters gleamed faintly in the morning light. Federal Bureau of Investigation. She held it high, her arm steady despite the blood dripping from her fingers. For a moment, silence fell. The kind of silence that only comes when reality collides with the script everyone expected. A few officers exchanged glances, their shouts caught in their throats. The badge carried weight, more weight than Callahan had anticipated. But then the silence cracked. Callahan's snarl returned, louder, desperate. "Don't fall for her lies. You saw it. She's armed. She's dangerous." He spat blood into the dirt, playing the victim. "Badge or not, she pulled a gun on me." Danielle's knees weakened. She wanted to scream the truth, to lay bare what he had done, but the wall of uniforms closed in. She could see the conflict in their eyes, hesitation, confusion, but also something harder, more ingrained, the kind of loyalty that ran deeper than truth. A voice from behind broke the standstill, calm, deliberate, almost rehearsed. "Federal or not," a union representative muttered, stepping up beside the ranking officer. "She's not one of us." The words landed heavy, a chilling reminder of the invisible lines drawn in law enforcement, the lines between blue and everything else. The order was given, "Cuff her." Danielle's badge glinted one last time before rough hands seized her wrists, twisting them behind her back. Metal bit into her skin. Her weapon was kicked aside. She lowered her head, fury and disbelief swirling as her sanctuary turned into a cage. They dragged her toward the patrol car, her legs unsteady, blood leaving a trail across the dirt. Behind her, Ethan Walsh shouted, his phone still held high as he streamed every second, "Don't you touch her! Everyone's watching!" His voice was sharp with defiance, echoing against the trees. Two officers broke off, charging at him. Their boots pounded the earth, their arms outstretched. Ethan stumbled back, but kept the camera steady, capturing Danielle in cuffs, Callahan's bloodied uniform, the tightening blue wall. "Put the phone down," one officer barked. "It's already online," Ethan shouted, his eyes blazing. "You'll never bury it. It's live right now." The declaration cut through the clearing like lightning. Callahan's head whipped around, his face draining of color for the first time. He lunged toward Ethan despite his wound, shouting, "Seize that damn phone!" The officers didn't hesitate. They ripped it from Ethan's grip, shoving him to the ground. His knees slammed into the dirt, but his voice didn't falter. "You can take the phone, but it's too late. The world has seen you." One officer twisted Ethan's arms behind his back, the crack of cuffs snapping shut. Another pocketed the phone, already thumbing at the screen, fumbling with panic. "Delete the feed," Callahan ordered, his voice raw with urgency. But Ethan only laughed, the sound strained but victorious. "Doesn't matter. Clips are already out there. Hashtags are flying. You can't stop it." Danielle's head lifted at his words, a fragile spark of hope flickering in her chest. The pain from her wounds was searing, the humiliation of the cuffs unbearable, but Ethan's defiance told her she wasn't alone. Even here, in the stronghold of the badge, cracks had opened. The officers shoved Ethan into another squad car, slamming the door shut. Callahan leaned against the hood of his own cruiser, blood dripping down his leg, fury etched across his face. His dog sat beside him, whining softly, restless but obedient now. He glared at Danielle through the chaos, his expression promising that this was far from over. The cars roared to life, gravel spitting as the convoy prepared to pull away. Danielle sat stiff in the back seat, her wrists bound, her badge confiscated, her body aching. Through the window, she caught a final glimpse of Ethan, his face pressed to the glass of the other cruiser. He mouthed the words slowly, clearly, so she couldn't miss them. "It's already out there." By the time they reached the station, the footage was already spreading. Twitter lit up with clips of the dogs lunging, Danielle's screams, the shot that felled Callahan. TikTok feeds flooded with Ethan's shaky live stream, cut into pieces and shared faster than the officers could scrub them. The hashtags trended within hours. Justice for Danielle, Callahan cover-up, blue wall. Inside the station, however, a different narrative was taking shape. Danielle sat in an interrogation room, her arm bandaged poorly, her leg throbbing beneath layers of gauze. Her badge lay on the table, confiscated as evidence. Across from her, a sergeant scribbled notes, his tone clipped. "An armed FBI agent discharged her weapon against a deputy during an altercation in Greenwood Park," he read aloud, as though the script had already been approved. "That's not what happened," Danielle rasped, her voice raw from screaming. "He set his dogs on me. He attacked me." The sergeant didn't look up. Statement recorded. His pen scratched against the page. "Now, let's talk about why you fired on Deputy Callahan." Her chest tightened. Words failed her, choked by the weight of disbelief. She had faced criminals who lied better than this, but to see lawmen twist reality with such ease made her stomach turn. Meanwhile, outside the walls of the station, neighbors whispered. In grocery store aisles, in coffee shops, in church parking lots, the rumor spread. Danielle Carter, the FBI agent, had gone rogue. Local news outlets parroted the police line, their anchors solemn. Sources say a federal agent discharged her weapon during a confrontation with a decorated canine officer. The deputy sustained a gunshot wound to the thigh. The smear campaign moved faster than the truth. On screen, her name was not Agent Carter but armed suspect. The image of her in cuffs played on repeat, stripped of context, her dignity dragged into the mud. Danielle closed her eyes in that gray interrogation room, her body aching, her future uncertain. But beneath the humiliation, the fear, something else stirred. Ethan's words echoed in her mind. "It's already out there." She knew what that meant. The battle had only begun. The silence of Danielle's house was gone. In its place, a low hum of engines and the flashing glow of camera lights poured through the blinds. Reporters had set up camp outside her driveway, their vans parked like barricades, their cameras angled toward her front door. Every time she peered through the curtains, she saw them waiting, microphones ready, eager to capture a soundbite of the disgraced FBI agent. Her phone didn't stop vibrating. At first, it was friends and co-workers reaching out in shock, but soon the messages shifted. Subject lines screamed in bold, "Traitor, you're finished." Her inbox filled with hate, emails accusing her of dishonoring the badge, of attacking a hero. Some messages dripped with racial venom, others promised she would pay. The phone calls were worse. A man's voice, deep and cold, hissed through the line late at night. "We know where you live." Another caller whispered, "You won't last here." She hung up each time, her hand trembling as she checked the locks on her doors, her mind racing with the image of Callahan's supporters lurking in the dark. Greenwood, the town she had called home for 5 years, no longer felt safe. Walking to her mailbox became a gauntlet. Neighbors she once exchanged pleasantries with avoided her gaze, whispering as she passed. One morning, she found her mailbox stuffed with photocopies of her mugshot, the one taken at the station after Callahan had her arrested. Red marker circled her face, and across it in bold letters, "Dangerous." Inside her home, she tried to keep her composure, but the walls seemed to close in. Her arms still ached where the dogs had torn flesh, her legs stiff with every step. The scars throbbed as a constant reminder that the attack wasn't just a nightmare, it was real, and it had followed her here. She sat at her kitchen table one evening, scrolling through the latest news coverage. A local anchor's voice filled the room. "Deputy Callahan, recovering from a gunshot wound, remains in stable condition." Police officials maintain that FBI agent Danielle Carter escalated the confrontation. Federal authorities have yet to issue a statement. Danielle slammed the laptop shut, the anger coursing through her veins. The truth was out there, yet every headline painted her as the aggressor. Her reputation, her career, her dignity, they were unraveling, and she felt powerless to stop it. The knock at the door startled her. Her hand instinctively reached for the Glock on the counter, though she hesitated, aware of how it might look with cameras lurking. She peered through the peephole and exhaled. Jason Reed stood on her porch, a familiar face in the sea of hostility. Jason Reed was not just a colleague. He was one of the few people in the bureau who had always treated her as more than a statistic or a token. Tall, with a sharp mind that rarely missed details, Jason carried the weary look of someone who had seen too much corruption to still be shocked, but cared too much to look away. Danielle opened the door quickly, pulling him inside before the press outside caught a glimpse. He carried a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, his expression grim. "You shouldn't be here alone," he said. "I don't have much choice," Danielle replied. "Everyone's keeping their distance. I'm radioactive." Jason dropped the bag on the floor and sat at the table, his eyes scanning the room. "I've been digging since I saw the footage. Danielle, you need to understand something. Callahan isn't just another dirty cop, he's untouchable." She leaned forward, her voice tight. "No one is untouchable. He sicked his dogs on me, that's assault." Jason shook his head. "On paper, he's a decorated canine handler. Years of commendations, union awards, community photo ops. He's got the kind of resume they trot out when budgets need defending. More importantly, he's protected. The union shields him, the commander shields him. Even some judges in this county owe him favors." Danielle felt her stomach twist. "So what? You're saying the truth won't matter?" Jason lowered his voice. "I'm saying the truth will be buried unless we dig deeper. I'll start combing through his record. There are always cracks, complaints, settlements, things swept under the rug. If we can find them, we can show people what he really is." For the first time in days, a flicker of relief passed over her face. "Why are you helping me?" "Because I know you," Jason said firmly. "You've never been reckless, never been dishonest. If they're doing this to you, they'll do it to anyone, and I'm not going to stand by while they destroy your life." Danielle swallowed hard, her throat tight with gratitude she couldn't voice. "Then be careful. They'll come after anyone who helps me." Jason's gaze hardened. Let them try. 2 days later, Danielle found herself summoned to police headquarters for a closed-door meeting. The press swarmed the steps outside as she entered, cameras flashing, questions hurled like stones. Inside, the corridors were cold, lined with plaques of officers who had served Greenwood for decades. She recognized none of the faces, yet she felt their eyes on her as if they were part of the blue wall closing in. The meeting room smelled of coffee and leather. At the head of the long table sat Commander Ellison, his presence as heavy as the silence he commanded. To his left, union lawyers shuffled papers. To his right, a cluster of officers leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed. The door opened again, and Callahan limped in. His leg was wrapped, his uniform pressed, the faint trace of smugness on his face despite the cane he leaned on. His dogs weren't there, but his aura of menace filled the room just the same. He sat, flanked by his lawyers, and the performance began. Danielle sat opposite him, her FBI badge placed deliberately on the table. She wanted them to see it, to remember it, but Ellison barely glanced at it. "You've stirred quite the storm," Ellison began, his voice gravelly. "Federal or not, you're standing in Greenwood, and here we protect our own." The words landed like a gavel. Danielle felt heat rise in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I was attacked. Your deputy set his dogs on me without cause." Callahan's lawyer interjected, voice smooth. "Our client responded to a perceived threat. The agent escalated, drew her weapon, and discharged it against a law enforcement officer. This is not conduct befitting the Bureau." Danielle's fists tightened under the table. She wanted to scream, to replay Ethan's footage for them frame by frame. But Ellison leaned back, steepling his fingers, and said the words she had feared. "Effective immediately, you are suspended from field duty. The Bureau will be notified. Until this is resolved, you will not operate in Greenwood." Her heart sank. They had clipped her wings. Without her authority in the field, she was more vulnerable than ever. Callahan smirked as if he had already won. But outside those walls, a different fight was brewing. Ethan's friends, a network of activists and digital warriors, had taken the footage global. Twitter threads dissected every frame, comparing Callahan's aggression to past abuses. TikTok creators stitched Ethan's video with their own commentary, their voices fiery and unyielding. On college campuses, students painted banners, "Her badge, our fight." Downtown marches drew crowds holding signs that bore her name, her face, her struggle. Danielle stood at her window that night, watching live streams of rallies erupting in cities she'd never even visited. Her world inside Greenwood had collapsed into silence and suspicion. But beyond it, people were shouting for her, carrying her voice where she could not. She pressed her hand to the glass, whispering to herself, "They can't bury the truth. Not anymore." Jason Reed's office at the Bureau was dim except for the glow of his monitor. Piles of case files and half-empty coffee cups covered the desk, but his eyes never left the screen. He had been digging for hours, combing through archives that stretched back years, searching for something, anything, that tied Callahan to a pattern of brutality. He told Danielle there would be cracks, and now he was close to proving it. Then, buried under layers of sealed documents and forgotten files, he found it. The name stopped him cold. Marcus Boone. 16 years old at the time of the incident. Greenwood High sophomore. Cause of death listed as accidental mauling during police intervention. Jason's jaw tightened. He pulled the file open and read the details. According to the report, Marcus had been suspected of burglary. Deputy Callahan and his K-9 unit responded. The dogs allegedly responded to aggression, and Marcus suffered fatal injuries. But the more Jason read, the clearer the lies became. Witness statements were missing. Photographs were redacted. The internal review concluded there was no misconduct. It was buried perfectly, too perfectly. Jason scrolled further, finding a note stamped across the final page. Sailed by order of County Council. The case had never gone public. Jason's chest felt heavy as he downloaded the documents and encrypted them. He knew this was it, the first real crack in the wall. Marcus Boone wasn't just a forgotten name, he was proof. Proof that Callahan's brutality stretched back years, and proof that Greenwood's leaders had chosen silence over justice. Later that night, Jason met Danielle at her house. She looked exhausted, her eyes shadowed, her posture rigid from carrying too much weight. But when Jason placed the file on her table, she sat up straighter. Marcus Boone, Jason said, 16 years old. Callahan's dogs mauled him to death. They buried him. Danielle opened the file slowly, her hands trembling as she read. The photographs, even redacted, told enough. The language of the report was sanitized, but the truth bled through. She closed her eyes, whispering, "A child." Jason nodded grimly. And they made sure no one ever found out. Danielle pressed her palms against the table, forcing herself not to cry. She thought of her own scars, still healing. She thought of Marcus, who never had the chance to heal at all. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was a history of blood. "Get me his family," she said quietly. "If they silenced his mother, I want to hear her voice." The call came just past midnight. Jason had tracked down a number for Marcus Boone's mother, Gloria. She answered with a voice that sounded worn thin, like years of grief had hollowed her out. "This is Danielle Carter," Danielle began, her tone steady but respectful. "I'm an FBI agent. I need to ask you about your son." There was silence on the line, followed by a long, shaky breath. Then Gloria spoke, her voice breaking. "No one's asked me about Marcus in 16 years. Danielle felt her throat tighten. "I need to hear what happened, please." The words spilled out in fragments, punctuated by sobs. Gloria described how Marcus had gone out that night to walk home from a friend's house, how neighbors heard him screaming, how she rushed to the hospital only to be told he was gone. The official story was that Marcus had attacked the dogs, but Gloria's voice carried the weight of truth. "They said my boy provoked it," she wept. "My baby was a quiet boy. He was afraid of dogs. He never would have raised a hand." Danielle held the phone tightly, tears running silently down her cheeks. She couldn't interrupt. Gloria's pain was a river, long suppressed, now spilling uncontrollably. She spoke of how officials came to her door, warning her to let it go, how the county sent a lawyer to her home, offering a small settlement in exchange for silence. She signed because she was alone, because the pressure was unbearable, but the guilt of signing never left her. "My son died, and they made me feel like I killed him by not fighting harder," Gloria whispered. "Every day I see his face, every night I hear his screams." Danielle's chest burned with rage. "You did nothing wrong," she said fiercely. "They did this. Callahan did this." Gloria sobbed harder. "No one's ever said his name since. They erased him. My Marcus never got justice." Danielle promised her she would not let Marcus's story stay buried. "You have my word. This will not end in silence again." When the call ended, Danielle sat in the dark, shaking. She replayed Gloria's words, the way grief seemed to echo through the line even after she hung up. It wasn't just about Callahan anymore. It was about a system that had chosen to protect him at the cost of children like Marcus. Jason leaned against the wall, his expression grim. "We've got more than one crack in the wall now. This is rot, Danielle, and it runs deep." Danielle nodded. "Then we follow it, no matter how far it goes." Jason's digging didn't stop at Marcus Boone. Once the first thread unraveled, others followed. He traced documents, court orders, and budget records, piecing together a map of hidden cover-ups. Patterns emerged. Several cases, all within the same year, showed evidence of brutality complaints against Callahan's unit. Each case ended the same way: evidence sealed, settlements issued, stories suppressed. And one name kept surfacing alongside them: councilman Richard Clean. Jason pulled financial records that showed Clen's signature authorizing emergency funds for community safety initiatives. During the same months, Callahan's complaints surged. Danielle studied the files, her voice cold. Clen wasn't just covering for him, he was funding him. This was protection bought and paid for. The picture was becoming clearer. Greenwood wasn't protecting Callahan out of loyalty alone. He was valuable, a tool of control, and Clean was the hand guiding it. That night, Danielle left headquarters after reviewing the files with Jason. The lot was empty, the lamps casting long shadows across the asphalt. Her keys jingled softly in her hand as she approached her car. Then she heard it. The slam of an SUV door behind her. Her instincts kicked in. She turned sharply, her hand brushing the inside of her coat where her badge and firearm rested. Out of the darkness, a tall man stepped forward, his face hidden by a baseball cap pulled low. His voice was low, deliberate, meant to chill. "You don't know when to quit, Agent Carter." Danielle's pulse quickened, but she didn't flinch. "Identify yourself." The man chuckled, the sound echoing in the empty lot. "You're digging in the wrong graves. Marcus Boone, Clayne Callahan. It's all buried for a reason. People who go looking for ghosts usually end up becoming one." He stepped closer, his breath visible in the cold night air. "The last thing you'll hear is a car door slam in the dark." The words sent a chill down Danielle's spine, but she held her ground. Her hand tightened on her phone, recording every word. "You think fear will stop me?" she said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. "Fear only works if I stop walking. And I don't stop." The man sneered, then backed away, slipping into the SUV. The engine roared to life and the vehicle sped off into the night, leaving her standing in the shadows with her phone still recording, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. Danielle looked down at the glowing screen. She had the threat captured. Proof that the walls around Callahan weren't just local. They were fortified by men willing to intimidate, to threaten, to silence. But she wasn't going to bend, not now, not ever. She whispered to herself, a vow in the silence of the lot. "They buried Marcus. They won't bury me." The knock on Danielle's door came early in the morning. She had barely slept, replaying the threat in the parking lot over and over. When she opened the door, Jason was standing there, but he wasn't alone. A tall man in a worn firefighter's jacket stood beside him, his expression guarded but determined. Jason introduced him softly. "This is Captain Roy Jennings. He has something you need to hear." Jennings stepped inside, removing his cap, his hands trembling slightly. He was a veteran firefighter, his hair streaked with gray, his face etched with years of smoke and sacrifice. He didn't sit down right away, pacing instead, as if wrestling with whether to speak. "I saw him do it," Jennings finally said, "years ago. Callahan." Danielle's breath caught. She motioned for him to continue. "It was a house fire out on Derby Street," Jennings explained. "We were pulling kids out when the call came in about a burglary next door. Callahan rolled up with his dogs. There was no burglary, just a scared kid running from the smoke. 16, maybe 17. His eyes darkened. Callahan let the dogs loose anyway. They tore into him before anyone could stop it." Danielle felt her stomach twist. "Marcus Boone," she whispered. Jennings nodded grimly. "I didn't know his name then, but I remember his screams. I remember trying to pull the dogs off, while Callahan laughed. He said the boy should have run faster." Danielle's hands clenched into fists. "Why didn't you come forward?" Jennings's shoulders sagged. "I tried. I wrote a report. 2 days later, the chief called me in. Said if I kept talking, I'd lose my pension. Said my wife and kids might not be safe. That was enough. I kept my mouth shut. I've lived with that guilt every day since." The weight in his voice was unbearable, like a confession that had been festering for years. Danielle leaned forward, her tone firm but compassionate. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore. If you're willing, your testimony could break this open." Jennings hesitated, his eyes glistening. "I'll testify, but only if you can promise my family won't pay the price. My wife didn't sign up for this war." Danielle exchanged a look with Jason. They both knew they couldn't guarantee safety in Greenwood, not fully. But Danielle's voice was steady as she answered, "We'll protect them, I swear to you. No more silence, no more fear." For the first time, Jennings looked relieved. His shoulders straightened, and though his hands still shook, his voice grew stronger. "Then I'm with you, whatever it takes." Danielle nodded. A new ally had stepped out of the shadows, and with him came a truth too powerful to bury again. The council chambers were packed 2 days later. Word had spread across Greenwood and beyond. Danielle Carter, the FBI agent who survived Callahan's attack, was set to present evidence in a public session. The crowd spilled into the hallways, television crews lined the aisles, and national news anchors took their places at the back. The city had become a stage, and the curtain was rising. Danielle entered, flanked by Jason and Captain Jennings. Her posture was unyielding, though she could feel the tension radiating through the room. On one side, community members held signs reading "Justice for Marcus" and her badge, "Our Fight." On the other, Callahan's supporters from the police union waved banners that read, "Stand with our deputy and protect the badge." The divide cut through the room like a blade. Councilman Clean presided at the front, his face carefully composed, but Danielle saw the flicker of unease in his eyes. He didn't expect her to come this far. When her name was called, Danielle stood before the microphone. She held up Marcus Boone's sealed file for the cameras to see. Her voice was calm, but every word carried weight. 16 years ago, Marcus Boone was mauled to death by Deputy Callahan's dogs. The case was buried, sealed under orders of this very council. His mother was silenced with threats and settlements. Tonight, his name will not be buried again. The room erupted. Shouts, gasps, sobs. Danielle waited until the noise dimmed, then continued. She presented photographs, the redacted files, and Gloria Boone's testimony. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer against the wall of silence that had protected Callahan for years. Then Jennings stepped forward. His hands trembled, but his voice was steady. "My name is Captain Roy Jennings. I was there the night Marcus Boone died. I saw Callahan unleash his dogs on that boy. I tried to stop it, and I was silenced. But I won't be silent anymore." The cameras zoomed in on his face as the room exploded with sound. Some cheered, others shouted him down, but the truth had been spoken, on record, in public under oath. Danielle turned to the council, her voice sharp. "This is not just about one deputy. This is about a system that chose silence over justice. How many more files are buried? How many more families silenced? You can no longer pretend you didn't know." The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. For a moment, no one moved. And then, from the back of the chamber, a figure rose. Callahan. He walked down the aisle, his limp pronounced, his face red with fury. The crowd parted reluctantly as he shoved his way forward. When he reached the front, his voice shook with rage. "You're tearing this city apart," he screamed. The chamber erupted into chaos. Callahan's supporters cheered, stamping their feet, shouting his name. Others booed and jeered, calling for his badge, his arrest, his life in prison. The council president banged his gavel helplessly, trying to restore order, but Callahan's voice rose above it all. "You think you can come here, drag my name through the mud, and destroy everything we've built? This city stands because of men like me. Men who protect it from people like you." He jabbed a finger at Danielle, his face twisted with venom. "You don't belong here. You're an outsider, a liar, and you're trying to rip Greenwood apart." Danielle stood tall, refusing to flinch. "The only thing tearing this city apart is the truth you've tried to bury." The clash of voices grew louder. Union members shouted insults at Danielle and Jennings, while community members shouted back. demanding justice. The tension was electric, ready to ignite. Then, in the middle of the storm, another figure walked in, Ethan. The young man who had recorded Callahan's attack, whose video had sparked the firestorm, had been released from custody just hours earlier. His face bore fresh bruises, but his posture was unbroken. He walked with deliberate steps to stand beside Danielle, his presence drawing silence like a magnet. The cameras swung toward him, the crowd holding its breath. He spoke into the microphone, his voice hoarse but steady. "My name is Ethan Hayes. I was arrested, harassed, and silenced because I filmed the truth. But you can't lock up the truth. It's bigger than me. It's bigger than any of us, and we're not backing down." The room erupted again, but this time the energy shifted. Cheers rose louder than jeers. Supporters chanted Ethan's name. Others shouted, "Justice for Marcus." The tide was turning, and for the first time, Callahan looked unsettled. He snarled, pointing at Ethan, "You think you're a hero? You're a criminal, a punk with a camera." Ethan didn't waver. He looked Callahan dead in the eye. "I'm proof you can't hide forever." The words landed like a strike, and the crowd roared its approval. Danielle placed a hand lightly on Ethan's shoulder, steadying him, anchoring them both in the storm. Then she turned back to the council, her voice clear. "The people of Greenwood are speaking. You can choose to listen, or you can keep burying files and silencing voices. But the truth is here, and it's not going away." The gavel pounded again, but it was useless. The chamber was no longer under the council's control. It belonged to the people. Angry, grieving, hopeful, defiant. Danielle could feel the shift. They weren't alone anymore. The walls around Callahan were cracking, and the world was watching. She leaned forward, speaking one final sentence into the microphone. "This fight isn't over, not by a long shot." The crowd roared in response. Callahan shouted curses as union members dragged him back, while cameras captured every second. The battle lines were drawn, clearer than ever before. Allies had stepped forward. Enemies had revealed themselves. And Danielle knew the storm had only just begun. The fallout from the council chambers was immediate and ferocious. Danielle's face was everywhere. National broadcasts, local news, and countless online clips replayed Callahan's furious outburst, Jennings's trembling testimony, and Ethan's defiant words. But along with the coverage came the counterattack. By dawn the next morning, Greenwood was buzzing with a new narrative, one carefully planted and engineered. It began with a leaked file. A supposed internal memo from the FBI suggesting Danielle had once been flagged for emotional instability during a previous assignment. Within hours, right-wing blogs and anonymous forums spread it like wildfire. Headlines blared across screens: "Unstable agent at center of Greenwood scandal," and "Danielle Carter, dangerous, unfit, unhinged." The smear campaign grew with terrifying speed. Comment sections beneath articles were flooded with the same phrases, repeated over and over, as if scripted. "She's unstable. She's dangerous. She's lying to destroy a good man." Bots amplified the message, drowning out real voices with manufactured outrage. Even television pundits who had once cautiously supported her began to hedge, wondering aloud if perhaps her judgment had been compromised. Danielle watched it unfold from her small apartment, her hands gripping the edge of the kitchen table until her knuckles whitened. Jason sat across from her, his laptop open, as he scrolled through the tidal wave of disinformation. "They're good," he muttered bitterly. "They know exactly how to twist the knife." "It's not just lies," Danielle whispered. "It's erasure. They're trying to rewrite me into something I'm not, a liability, a hysterical woman." Jason looked up sharply. "That's exactly why it's working. They want people to doubt not just your evidence, but your sanity. If they can discredit you, the whole case crumbles." Danielle pushed back from the table, pacing the room. "It doesn't matter how many files we dig up, how many witnesses we find. If people don't believe me, if they think I'm some unstable agent with a vendetta, then..." Callahan wins. Her phone buzzed with alerts. Some were messages of support from allies who knew the truth. Others were threats, venomous messages calling her a liar, a traitor, a disgrace. Some warned she wouldn't live to see the trial. The anonymity made them faceless, but their cruelty hit hard. Jason closed the laptop with a snap. "You need to ignore it." Danielle turned to him, her voice trembling. "Ignore it? Jason, this is the court of public opinion. Right now, it matters as much as any courtroom. They're poisoning the well before the case even starts." Jason exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "Then we fight it differently. They're using noise to drown you out. You'll need more than evidence. You'll need to remind people who you really are." The words lingered in the room, but Danielle couldn't respond. The weight of the smear campaign was suffocating, and for the first time since the attack, she felt herself faltering. Her enemies had weapons she couldn't see, armies she couldn't fight in the open, and their aim was precise: her name, her voice, her sanity. That night, alone in her apartment, the pressure cracked her open. Danielle sat on the edge of her bed, the glow of her phone casting harsh light on her face. The comments scrawled endlessly, cruel words digging into her like claws. She set the phone aside, but the voices lingered, echoing in her head. She buried her face in her hands. For the first time since Callahan had slammed her against the courthouse wall, she let herself sob. Her body shook with it, years of discipline unraveling in a storm of grief and exhaustion. The images came back unbidden. Callahan's fist raised, the slam of the door in the dark parking lot, the terrified voice of Marcus Boone's mother. Each memory fused with the taunts from strangers online until it felt unbearable, a chorus of violence and doubt screaming that she wasn't enough. She whispered into the empty room, "Maybe they're right. Maybe I can't win this. Maybe..." Her voice trailed off into silence. Minutes passed before a knock at the door jolted her. She wiped her face quickly, trying to erase the evidence of her collapse. When she opened the door, Jason stood there, holding 2 cups of coffee. He didn't speak at first, just handed one to her and stepped inside. He studied her face for a long moment, his expression softening. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said quietly. "I know what they're doing to you." Danielle's voice cracked. "They're winning, Jason. They're rewriting me and I can't stop them. Every lie spreads faster than the truth." Jason set his coffee down and sat across from her. His voice was calm, steady, like an anchor in a storm. "Listen to me. You lived. That's your weapon. Callahan tried to break you in that courthouse, and you're still here. They can't erase that, no matter how many lies they spin." She shook her head. "But what if no one sees it? What if all they remember is the smear?" "Then you show them," Jason said firmly. "Not with silence, not with hiding, with truth, with courage. You've already survived the worst of him. Now you remind the world what that survival means." Danielle let the words sink in, her breathing slowing, the storm inside her easing slightly. Jason wasn't giving her solutions. He was giving her perspective. Surviving had not been weakness. It was strength. And strength could be wielded. She looked at him through damp eyes. "You really believe that?" Jason nodded without hesitation. "I've seen you fight when others would have broken. I've seen you carry wounds that should have silenced you, and still you stand. That's not instability, that's resilience. And it terrifies them, because they can't control it." Something shifted inside Danielle then, small but steady. The lies still hurt, the doubts still lingered, but Jason's words carved out a space for defiance. She wasn't just fighting Callahan. She was fighting the machinery of silence and erasure. And if she gave up now, everything Marcus, Jennings, Ethan, and so many others had risked would vanish into the dark. Danielle wiped her face and straightened her shoulders. The tears had run their course, but in their wake came clarity. Jason's words had reminded her of a truth she had almost forgotten. She had lived, and survival was a kind of weapon no smear campaign could steal. By morning, Danielle's decision was clear. She stood in front of the mirror, studying her reflection. The face staring back was tired, worn from battles, both public and private, but her eyes held something new: resolve. The smear campaign had forced her into a corner, but instead of retreating, she would choose the battleground herself. Jason joined her at the table, reviewing notes and evidence. "So what's the move?" he asked. Danielle looked up, her voice steady. "We take it all public. Not just the files, not just the counsel. Federal court, every document, every testimony, every threat. No more shadows. If they want a war in the open, I'll give them one." Jason exhaled, a mixture of relief and concern. "That's dangerous. Once you go federal, there's no pulling it back. They'll come after you harder." "They already are," Danielle replied. "This way, the fight isn't just in their echo chambers. It's in a courtroom where lies have consequences." Jason nodded slowly. "Then we prepare. Evidence airtight, witnesses ready, no room for doubt." The following days blurred into relentless preparation. Danielle contacted federal prosecutors, delivering the files she and Jason had uncovered, along with Jennings's sworn statement and Ethan's footage. She insisted the case be opened formally, not as a local matter vulnerable to counsel interference, but as a federal investigation into civil rights violations, abuse of power, and systemic corruption. Her decision reverberated across Greenwood. For her allies, it was a rallying cry. Supporters gathered outside her apartment with candles, chanting for justice, their voices defiant against the smear campaign. For her enemies, it was an escalation. New leaks appeared online. Doctored photos, falsified reports, accusations of affairs and corruption. But the louder they shouted, the more the public began to see the desperation behind it. One evening, as Danielle reviewed files at her desk, Jason looked over at her. "You know this means you'll be under oath yourself. They'll tear through every inch of your life looking for cracks." Danielle met his gaze without flinching. "Then let them. I've spent too long letting their lies define me. It's time to put the truth on record." Jason smiled faintly, pride flickering in his eyes. "Then we're all in. No turning back." The first federal filing hit the news within 48 hours. Headlines screamed, "FBI agent files civil rights suit against Deputy Callahan." The narrative shifted again. For every smear, there was now a counterpoint. Evidence, testimony, official filings that couldn't be erased by bots or rumors. The court of public opinion was still volatile, but for the first time, Danielle wasn't just defending herself. She was forcing Callahan and his allies to answer. That night, she stood on her balcony, listening to the faint sound of chants from a gathering down the street. "Justice for Marcus," they called. The words carried through the dark, a reminder that this fight was no longer hers alone. Jason stepped beside her, the cool night air heavy with tension but also with hope. "You've chosen the arena," he said. Danielle nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "And now we win it." The federal courthouse in Greenwood was unlike anything the town had seen in years. Reporters filled the sidewalks outside, their cameras pointed at the heavy doors as crowds pressed against barriers chanting for justice. Every news channel carried live coverage. By the time Danielle and Jason stepped through the entrance, the trial had already become a national spectacle. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The gallery was packed with residents, activists, off-duty officers, and out-of-town observers who wanted to witness the showdown. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for cutting through theatrics, presided over the room with a stern presence. Every gavel strike silenced the hum of voices instantly. Danielle felt the weight of every eye on her as she sat at the plaintiff's table. Jason leaned toward her, whispering, "This is it. Everything we've built comes down to this room." She nodded but didn't answer. Her pulse pounded in her ears, a steady drumbeat of anticipation and dread. She had chosen this arena, and now there was no retreat. The trial opened with the government's case. Prosecutors laid out a timeline of Callahan's abuse of authority. from buried complaints to the night of Danielle's attack. Exhibits flashed on screens, grainy photographs, internal reports stamped confidential, affidavits signed by silenced victims. The jury leaned forward, absorbing every detail. Across the room, Callahan sat rigid at the defense table. He wore a navy suit, his badge pinned inside his lapel like a reminder of who he believed himself to be. His jaw clenched as prosecutors described his pattern of intimidation. Behind him sat members of the police union, their folded arms a wall of solidarity. The first witness called was Captain Roy Jennings. The retired firefighter walked slowly to the stand, his hands trembling slightly. The prosecutor guided him through questions, and his voice, though quivering at first, grew steadier as he recounted what he had seen years earlier. "I watched Deputy Callahan unleash his dogs on 2 teenagers," Jennings testified, his gaze fixed on the jury. "They weren't resisting, they weren't even fighting. He let them loose because he could, and when I filed my report, it disappeared. I was told if I valued my pension, I'd keep quiet." The defense attorney rose for cross-examination, trying to chip away at Jennings's credibility. "Captain Jennings, isn't it true you held a personal grudge against Deputy Callahan because of disagreements at community safety meetings?" Jennings squared his shoulders, meeting the lawyer's stare. "My only grudge is against abuse. I kept silent too long. I won't do it again." The room stirred, murmurs sweeping through the gallery. Danielle's chest tightened, pride mingling with sorrow. Jennings had risked everything to tell the truth, and in doing so, he had made Callahan's cruelty visible. The judge rapped her gavel once, restoring order. The trial moved forward, each moment sharpening the stakes. The next witness called was Ethan. The young man walked confidently to the stand, his posture upright, though Danielle noticed the flicker of nerves in his hands as he was sworn in. He had been through so much: wrongful detention, intimidation, the weight of being both a survivor and a witness. Now his voice carried the gravity of a generation demanding change. The prosecutor began by introducing the footage Ethan had live-streamed on the night of Danielle's assault. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the screen came alive with shaky but powerful images. Callahan's looming figure, the violence unfolding. Danielle's body against the wall. The jury watched intently, their faces tightening as the rawness of the video cut through the silence. Ethan's voice narrated from the stand. "I started recording because I knew what would happen if I didn't. People needed to see what Greenwood pretended wasn't real. They needed proof." When the defense attorney rose, his strategy was clear: discredit the messenger. He leaned on the podium, his tone sharp. "Mr. Price, you've been arrested before, haven't you? Disorderly conduct? Trespassing. Isn't it true you seek out confrontation with law enforcement?" Ethan met the attack head-on. "I've been arrested for standing where I wasn't supposed to, for raising my voice where they didn't want it raised. But I've never lied, and I never staged this video. What you're watching is the truth you buried." The defense pressed harder. "Isn't it also true you have a personal vendetta against Deputy Callahan?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "I have a vendetta against brutality, against men who think a badge means they're above the law." The gallery erupted in applause before the judge's gavel slammed down. "Order!" she barked, her voice slicing through the noise. The jury, however, had already seen what mattered. They had witnessed the video. They had heard Ethan's conviction. Danielle felt tears prick her eyes. Ethan wasn't just defending her. He was defending everyone who had been silenced. He stood as living proof that the truth could survive attempts to bury it. Then came the moment Danielle had dreaded most. The prosecutor called her name. She rose slowly, every muscle taut, and walked to the witness stand. The room seemed to close in around her. For a brief moment, she caught Callahan's eyes. He smirked, as if daring her to falter. Taking the oath, Danielle steadied her breath. The questions began gently, guiding her through her background, her role, and finally, the night of the attack. Her voice trembled as she recounted each detail: the sudden grip on her arm, the slam against the wall, the terror that she might not walk away. At one point, the prosecutor asked, "Ms. Carter, can you show the court the injuries you sustained that night?" Danielle's hands shook as she lifted her sleeve, revealing faint scars along her arm, the lingering marks of Callahan's violence. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The scars were not just wounds, they were testimony carved into her skin. Her voice cracked as she finished. "He wanted to silence me. He wanted to remind me of his power. But I'm here because I won't let him erase what he's done. Not to me, not to anyone." The judge allowed a pause before signaling the defense. The cross-examination loomed, sharp and cold, waiting to test her resolve. The defense attorney rose, adjusting his tie as he approached Danielle. His tone was measured, but underneath it ran a current of disdain. "Ms. Carter, isn't it true that you have been labeled unstable in prior FBI records?" Danielle's stomach clenched, but she held her ground. "That record was fabricated during a smear campaign. It has no basis in fact." The attorney smirked. "Convenient. And yet here you are, emotional, clearly struggling under pressure. Isn't it possible your memory of that night is clouded by stress?" Danielle lifted her chin. "My memory is clear. Trauma doesn't erase the truth. It carves it deeper." The jury's eyes flicked toward her, watching the strength in her response. The defense pressed on, but each attempt to paint her as unstable seemed to falter against the solidity of her presence. When the cross-examination ended, Danielle stepped down from the stand with her head high. She had relived the nightmare, but she had survived it again, this time in front of the world. Finally, it was Callahan's turn. The deputy walked to the stand with the confidence of a man who had spent years bending systems to his will. He spoke of his career, his service, the dangers he had faced. He painted himself as a protector, a man forced to make hard choices in the name of order. "I did what needed to be done," he declared. "I've kept Greenwood safe, and now, because of political games, I'm the one on trial." For a moment, his performance seemed polished, even convincing, but under cross-examination, the cracks began to show. The prosecutor's voice was sharp as he held up a stack of papers. "Deputy Callahan, these are 12 separate complaints filed against you over the last decade. Excessive force, intimidation, unlawful detention. Can you explain why none of these reached disciplinary review?" Callahan shifted in his seat, his composure slipping. "Baseless claims, people trying to smear me." The prosecutor pressed. "All 12? Including the one filed by Captain Jennings? Including the ones corroborated by hospital records and sworn statements? Are they all fabrications?" Callahan's voice rose, strained. "You don't understand what it takes to keep a city like Greenwood under control. Sometimes you have to be tough." The prosecutor's voice cut through. "Tough isn't unleashing dogs on teenagers. Tough isn't burying 12 complaints. That's abuse, deputy." Callahan's face reddened, his jaw tight. He opened his mouth to respond, but the silence of the courtroom pressed down on him. The jury's eyes bore into him, and for the first time, he seemed small, his authority shrinking beneath the weight of accountability. The judge struck her gavel, signaling a recess. As the jury filed out, Danielle sat back at the table, her body trembling with adrenaline. Jason leaned toward her, whispering, "He cracked. They saw it." She nodded, exhaling shakily. For the first time, hope felt tangible. Callahan was no longer untouchable. His mask had slipped, and beneath it, the jury had glimpsed the man he truly was. The courtroom returned from recess with an unusual tension in the air. Everyone sensed that something was shifting, that the trial had reached a moment where the truth could no longer be held back. Danielle sat rigid in her chair, Jason's hand lightly gripping her shoulder for steadiness. Across the aisle, Callahan tried to regain his swagger, but his eyes darted more than before, his jaw set too tightly. The prosecutor rose, holding a slim folder that hadn't yet been introduced. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of revelation. The government would like to introduce newly authenticated evidence obtained just last night. It pertains directly to Deputy Callahan's intent on the night in question. Callahan's attorney shot to his feet. "Objection! This is a last-minute ambush. We were not informed of any new materials." The judge regarded him coolly. "You will have time to review. Sit down. Let the prosecution proceed." The lights dimmed slightly as the court technician brought up an audio file. A hush fell over the room as the speakers crackled to life. Static gave way to a clipped but unmistakable voice. Callahan's. "Today, I'm going to teach these people a lesson." The words hung in the air, venomous and undeniable. The date stamp on the recording matched the night of Danielle's assault. The courtroom seemed to freeze. No one moved, no one breathed. The prosecution let the silence linger before speaking. That radio chatter was recovered from internal dispatch archives. Deputy Callahan's own voice moments before he attacked Ms. Carter. Not a mistake, not a misjudgment, a decision. The gallery erupted with whispers, gasps, and muffled exclamations. The judge's gavel slammed repeatedly until order was restored, but the energy in the room had already shifted. Callahan's mask of control cracked visibly. His face drained of color, his hands clenched into fists on the table. Jason leaned closer to Danielle, whispering so only she could hear. "That's it. That's the nail in his coffin." Danielle's throat tightened. She remembered the smirk on Callahan's face that night, the cold satisfaction in his grip. Now the jury had heard it too. Proof that his violence had been deliberate, not reactive. He had wanted to send a message, and he had said it out loud. The defense attorney scrambled to his feet. "This is out of context. That recording could be referencing any number of situations. We all know radio chatter can be misconstrued." But the prosecutor was ready. Then perhaps the defense would like to explain why this chatter directly preceded an unprovoked attack on a civilian, corroborated by video evidence, eyewitness testimony, and medical records. The jury can decide whether it's coincidence or a confession. The judge allowed the evidence into the record. The jury's eyes flicked repeatedly toward Callahan, studying him with new scrutiny. For the first time, he slumped in his chair, shoulders hunched, no longer the towering figure of authority. His aura of invincibility had been punctured. The words he thought would vanish into the static had returned to bury him. The prosecution pressed forward, capitalizing on the momentum. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the attorney began, turning to face them directly, "you've now heard what we've been arguing all along. This was never about one night or one bad decision. This was about a man who used his badge as a weapon, who viewed his own community as an enemy to be subdued." He paced slowly, his voice steady. Deputy Callahan said it himself. "I'm going to teach these people a lesson. That is not the voice of protection. That is not the spirit of service. That is the mindset of oppression, and it's not just Miss Carter who suffered. It's every single complaint buried, every voice silenced, every citizen made to feel powerless." The defense rose for their closing argument, but the air in the courtroom was no longer theirs to control. The attorney tried to refocus the jury, painting Callahan as a misunderstood officer, a man pushed to the edge by the chaos of his job. "Context matters," he insisted. "Every day, officers face danger, disrespect, impossible decisions. Deputy Callahan was one of the toughest among them, and toughness sometimes gets misinterpreted. Don't let one phrase, torn from its context, outweigh decades of service." But the argument sounded hollow, even to the gallery. The contrast between the defense's polished words and Callahan's raw recording was too stark. Every time the attorney tried to humanize his client, the jury seemed to remember that chilling voice over the radio, dripping with malice. The prosecution stood again, delivering the final blow. This case has never been about politics or unions or reputations. It is about accountability. When an officer says he will teach his community a lesson and then brutalizes one of its members, it is not misinterpretation, it is method, it is intent, and it is a crime. The judge called for order as both sides rested. The jury was instructed, their faces solemn as they filed out to deliberate. The gallery buzzed with nervous energy, a storm of whispers and exchanged looks. Danielle sat in stillness, her heart hammering. Jason leaned toward her. It's in their hands now, but after that tape, they can't look past it. Danielle nodded faintly. I just want it to be over, for everyone who never got their day in this room. Hours passed slowly. The jury's absence stretched like an endless shadow, each minute a new wave of tension. Outside, the crowds grew larger, chanting for justice. Reporters filled every available corner, their updates flickering across national broadcasts. Greenwood was no longer just a town, it had become a mirror for the nation. When the bailiff finally announced that the jury had reached a verdict, the entire room seemed to inhale at once. Danielle's hands clenched tightly in her lap. Jason gave her a steady look, silent but reassuring. This was the moment. The jury filed back into the box, their expressions grave. Danielle searched their faces for clues, but they were unreadable, their resolve etched into every line. The foreperson held a folded slip of paper, which was passed to the bailiff and then to the judge. The judge cleared her throat, her voice echoing through the tense courtroom. In the matter of the United States versus Deputy Thomas Callahan on the charge of civil rights violations under color of law, how does the jury find? The foreperson stood, his voice steady. Guilty. A wave of sound crashed through the courtroom. Gasps, cries, applause quickly cut off by the gavel. Danielle pressed her hands to her mouth, tears welling. Jason's arm wrapped firmly around her shoulders, steadying her as relief swept through her body. The judge continued. On the charge of excessive force resulting in bodily harm, how does the jury find? Guilty. Callahan shifted in his chair, his face flushed with disbelief. The gallery leaned forward, unable to look away. The judge pressed on. On the charge of conspiracy to cover up official misconduct, how does the jury find? Guilty. By the time the verdict was fully read, Callahan had been convicted on every single count. The courtroom exploded once more, this time with sobs of relief and cheers barely restrained by the judge's repeated calls for order. Danielle's tears spilled freely. She thought of the scars on her arm, of Ethan's courage, of Jennings's testimony, of every name buried in those 12 complaints. This wasn't just her victory. It belonged to all of them. The judge's voice cut through the din. Deputy Callahan, please rise. He stood reluctantly, his hands twitching as though he longed to clench them into fists. His once imposing frame now looked smaller, diminished beneath the weight of judgment. This court finds you guilty on all counts. Effective immediately, you are stripped of your badge and authority. Sentencing will follow, but for now, you are remanded into custody. A bailiff approached, unfastening the badge pinned inside Callahan's suit. The metallic click echoed like a final nail sealing a coffin. The symbol of power he had abused for decades was torn from him in open court, witnessed by all. For the first time since the trial began, Callahan's bravado collapsed. He slumped back, his eyes darting as if searching for an escape that no longer existed. The gallery leaned forward, watching the fall of a man who had once ruled Greenwood through fear. Outside, the news spread like wildfire. Crowds erupted into chants of victory, their voices rising in unison. Justice! Justice! Reporters delivered the verdict live, their words carried across the nation. Greenwood, once known only to its residents, was now etched into the country's conscience as the place where accountability had finally broken through. Inside, Danielle allowed herself a single deep breath. For the first time since that night, the weight pressing on her chest eased. Jason squeezed her hand, whispering, "It's done." She nodded, whispering back through tears, "It's just the beginning." The Greenwood City Council chamber was overflowing. Every seat filled, the aisles lined, people pressed shoulder to shoulder against the back walls. The verdict against Callahan had not just ended a trial, it had ignited a demand for change that swept through the town like wildfire. For weeks, citizens had poured into meetings, rallies, and vigils, all with the same message: never again. On this night, the council faced the heaviest agenda in decades. One by one, proposals that had once seemed impossible were laid on the table. The first was a motion to restrict the use of police dogs to life-threatening emergencies only. It was born from Danielle's own experience, the memory of sharp teeth and unprovoked violence replaying in the minds of the community. The council chair cleared his throat. "We open the floor for discussion." A veteran officer in uniform stood. "I've worked with K9S for 20 years. They're loyal, they're effective, and they've saved lives. But even I can't deny that the way they've been used in Greenwood crossed a line. These dogs should protect, not terrorize. I support the reform." Applause rippled through the chamber. On the opposite side, an older council member shook his head. "You are gutting our officers' ability to control dangerous situations. What happens when an armed suspect refuses to comply? Do we risk the lives of officers because we've tied their hands?" The debate grew heated, voices overlapping, the chamber vibrating with urgency. Citizens rose to speak, each testimony a piece of Greenwood's collective wound. A mother described how her teenage son had been chased and bitten during a mistaken identity stop. An elderly man recalled the nights he avoided walking home from church out of fear of patrol units with unleashed dogs. Finally, a young woman in the back stood and raised her voice above the noise. "This isn't about stripping tools. It's about stripping away excuses. If you need a dog to handle unarmed teenagers or peaceful citizens, you shouldn't be wearing a badge." Her words landed like a stone in still water, silencing the room for a long moment. The council voted. One by one, hands rose. The motion passed. The chamber erupted into applause, some standing, some crying, the sound of a town choosing to change its future. The next motion introduced was mandatory body cameras for every officer, with strict penalties for disabling them. This time the debate was shorter. The memory of Callahan's trial still lingered, the grainy live stream from Ethan having provided the only unfiltered truth. If not for that footage, the case might never have reached court. A councilman who had once opposed such measures now spoke with conviction. The people of Greenwood should never again depend on the courage of a teenager to prove the truth. The cameras are not just for accountability, they are for protection, for both the citizens and the officers who serve with integrity. The motion passed almost unanimously. The gallery stood to their feet again, their cheers echoing off the walls. The reforms were no longer dreams whispered in private. They were law. Greenwood was being remade, one vote at a time. Outside the chamber, the streets were alive with the sound of chants and celebration. Word of the reforms traveled faster than the council could post the results. Car horns honked, church bells rang, and signs that had once been symbols of protest now became banners of victory. Danielle stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, her coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. For weeks, she had been the reluctant face of a movement she never asked to lead. Tonight, though, as people spotted her and began to cheer her name, she didn't shrink away. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to smile. Jason nudged her gently. "Look at them. Look at what you did." She shook her head softly. "No. Look at what we did. This was never just me." But the people didn't see it that way. To them, Danielle was proof that courage could stand against power and survive. Children ran up to her, pressing handmade thank you cards into her hands. Elderly churchgoers clasped her arms, tears streaming down their faces. "You gave us our voice back," one whispered. And then Ethan appeared, weaving through the crowd with a wide grin on his face. His phone was still in his hand, live streaming, just as it had been on that night when everything changed. He aimed the camera at Danielle and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, meet the woman who gave us our city back." The crowd roared, their voices lifting into the night sky. Danielle laughed, a sound that felt foreign and wonderful, her body lighter than it had been since before the attack. For so long she had carried the weight of her scars in silence. Now the people around her carried them too, not as shame, but as symbols of resilience. Jason leaned close to Ethan and whispered, "She's not used to this." Ethan nodded. "She doesn't have to be. The city's used to it now, they'll carry it forward." The celebration stretched into the night, but beneath the joy there was something steadier, something deeper. Greenwood had been cracked open, its ugliness exposed, its silence broken. Now it stood in the fragile but powerful space between what it had been and what it could become. Danielle took a long breath, her eyes sweeping across faces illuminated by streetlights and camera flashes. For the first time since that night, she felt free. Not because the trial was over, or because Callahan had been stripped of his badge, but because her city had chosen not to look away. They had chosen to fight for something better. Days later, Danielle walked alone through Greenwood's downtown, the early morning air crisp, the streets quieter than they had been during the chaos of the trial. Shopkeepers waved from their doorways, strangers stopped to thank her, children called her name as she passed. She no longer felt like a ghost moving through her hometown. She felt seen. The reforms passed by the council were already making ripples. Officers now wore body cameras, their red lights blinking like quiet reminders of transparency. The K-9 units had been pulled from routine patrols. Citizens filed into new oversight board meetings, empowered to hold their department accountable in ways they never had before. Greenwood was far from perfect, but it was changing. At the park where vigils had once been held, Danielle sat on a bench and watched families gather. Jason joined her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He set one beside her. "Do you realize how rare this is? Most towns never make it this far. They fight, they protest, and then things fade. But this place, it's different now." Danielle looked at the children playing. "It has to be, otherwise all of this was for nothing." He studied her for a long moment. "So, what about you? What happens now?" She hesitated. "I don't know. I never wanted to be the face of anything. I just wanted to survive. But if people see something in me, if it helps keep this momentum alive, maybe I have to keep going. Maybe survival isn't enough anymore." Jason smiled faintly. "That's the Danielle I know. Always braver than you think you are." Their quiet was broken by Ethan's familiar voice. He jogged toward them, his phone out as usual. "Sorry, had to catch this moment. The people want to see you smile again." Danielle laughed softly. "You're relentless." "Someone has to be," Ethan replied. "You gave us a story that mattered, and I'm not letting anyone forget it. Not tomorrow, not next year, not ever." The 3 of them sat together on the bench, the movement's unlikely trinity, the survivor, the friend, and the witness. Around them, Greenwood continued to breathe, to stumble, to rise. It was still a small town with long scars, but it was no longer silent. As the sun broke over the horizon, Danielle whispered almost to herself, "He tried to teach us a lesson, but maybe we taught him one instead." Jason placed his hand over hers. Ethan tilted his camera upward, capturing the skyline glowing with morning light. For the first time, Greenwood looked different, not because its buildings had changed, but because its people had. Danielle exhaled slowly, the weight of the past months settling and then lifting. She smiled again, not the cautious smile of survival, but the steady smile of someone who had endured and endured until the city around her began to change with her. Greenwood had been broken, but Greenwood had been transformed. And she, scarred but unbroken, walked free within it. The morning air in Greenwood was clear, bright, and touched with the kind of warmth that carried hope in it. Families gathered in the park, children perched on their parents' shoulders, and elders settled in folding chairs arranged in neat rows. The city had chosen this day to dedicate Greenwood Park under a new name, a name that carried the weight of struggle and the promise of change, Justice Trail. A small stage had been set up at the park entrance. where a bronze plaque sat hidden beneath a white cloth. Around it stood city officials, community leaders, pastors, and citizens who had pushed relentlessly for reforms. Danielle stood among them, her hands clasped together, her heart racing not with fear this time, but with anticipation. The mayor stepped forward, his voice strong but reverent. "We gather today to honor not just a verdict, not just a series of reforms, but a spirit that rose up in this city when it mattered most. Justice is not an easy road, but here in Greenwood, we walked it together. Today, this park becomes Justice Trail, a reminder that courage can transform a community." He gestured toward the cloth, and with careful hands he pulled it away. The bronze plaque gleamed in the sunlight. The words etched into it silenced the crowd for a moment, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling the trees. "In honor of those who stood, spoke, and suffered, so all might walk free." The inscription was simple, yet it carried the weight of every voice, every wound, every act of courage that had brought Greenwood to this moment. Danielle's chest tightened as she read the words, seeing not just her own struggle reflected there, but the faces of countless others who had borne the burden of injustice before her. Applause erupted, long and sustained, the kind that lifted the air and turned into something like a hymn. Children ran forward, touching the plaque with small hands, tracing the letters as though learning to read justice for the first time. Elderly citizens wiped tears from their eyes. The crowd was not just witnessing history, they were claiming it. Danielle felt Jason's hand rest gently on her shoulder. "You did this," he whispered. She shook her head softly. "We did this." The ceremony continued with speeches from clergy and council members, each speaking to the journey Greenwood had taken. But every time Danielle looked toward the plaque, she felt as though the city itself was speaking back to her, acknowledging what had once been denied. Finally, her name was called. She would take the stage, not as a victim, but as a survivor and a symbol of what Greenwood had chosen to become. She drew a deep breath and stepped forward, her heart pounding with the knowledge that her words mattered now more than ever. Danielle stood at the podium, her voice trembling at first, but steadying as she looked out over the sea of faces. These were her people, neighbors, friends, strangers who had become family through struggle. She spoke slowly, her words measured, each one carrying the weight of truth. "I never wanted to stand here. I never wanted to be the reason this trail exists, but life doesn't always give us choices. Sometimes it gives us trials, and what we do with them determines who we become." The crowd listened in silence, every word sinking deep. She raised her chin, her voice stronger now. "Justice isn't inherited, it's not passed down like property or position. It's built, step by step, choice by choice, by ordinary people who decide they will not look away anymore." Applause broke out, but Danielle lifted her hand gently, waiting for quiet to return. "When I was attacked, I thought my life had ended in a way that would define me forever. I thought my scars would only ever tell one story, of pain, of fear, of humiliation. But standing here, I see now that scars can tell more than one story. They can tell of survival, they can tell of resilience, and they can tell of a community that refused to let one person's suffering be in vain." Her voice softened as she looked toward the children playing at the edge of the crowd, their laughter drifting through the air. "Someday, those children will walk down this trail and see those words on the plaque. They'll ask what it means, and when they do, I hope you tell them that it means we fought for them. That it means we chose to believe in a Greenwood where they can walk free, where they don't have to fear the very people sworn to protect them." The crowd rose to their feet, the sound of their cheers echoing through the park, some chanting her name, others simply clapping until their hands were sore. Danielle closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over her, not as noise, but as affirmation. When she opened them again, her gaze found Ethan in the crowd. He was live streaming, as always, his lens capturing not just her words, but the emotion written across every face present. He raised his free hand in a silent salute, and she returned it with a nod. Danielle leaned toward the microphone one last time. "This trail doesn't belong to me. It belongs to you. It belongs to all of us. So walk it, run it. Teach your children what it means, because justice isn't a destination, it's a journey, and the trail is ours now." The ovation was thunderous. Children surged forward, racing down the newly renamed path, their laughter ringing like bells. The trail that had once been a place of silence and avoidance was alive with footsteps, each one writing a new chapter into Greenwood's story. As the ceremony drew to a close, the community gathered at the head of the trail for a symbolic walk. Danielle stood at the front, flanked by Jason and Ethan, with families, survivors, and allies lining up behind them. The path stretched ahead, freshly paved, its edges lined with flowers planted by volunteers. In the days leading up to the dedication, Danielle took the first step, her stride steady, her face calm but resolute. Around her, the sound of footsteps multiplied, a chorus of movement as the crowd followed her lead. Survivors of past abuses walked beside her, their heads held high. Mothers carried toddlers on their hips, teenagers held banners that read, "Never again in Greenwood," and elders leaned on canes, refusing to be left behind. The trail wound through the park, sunlight filtering through the trees, casting long shadows that felt less like reminders of darkness and more like evidence of light breaking through. Danielle's heart pounded, not with fear, but with the rhythm of the movement she had helped create. At one bend in the trail, Danielle slowed, her eyes catching sight of a mural painted on a nearby wall. It depicted a runner mid-stride, surrounded by silhouettes of people reaching upward. The words beneath it, bold and clear, "One woman's run became a movement." Jason followed her gaze. "They'll never forget." Danielle whispered back, "Neither will I." The walk turned into a jog, laughter breaking out as children sprinted ahead, urging the adults to follow. Danielle quickened her pace, her feet striking the pavement in time with dozens of others. For a moment it felt like she was back on the night of the attack, her body moving, her lungs burning. But this time, there were no sirens, no shouts, no fear. Only unity. Only strength. As they rounded the final stretch, the crowd surged together, a living wave of determination. Danielle crossed the symbolic finish line first, but she did not raise her arms in victory. Instead, she turned back, waiting until Jason, Ethan, and the rest of Greenwood caught up, the community arriving not as individuals, but as one. When the last steps fell into place, Danielle turned, her chest heaving, her face glowing with sweat and sunlight. She spoke, her voice strong enough to carry without a microphone. "This trail is not mine alone, it is ours. It carries every step we've taken together, and it carries every step we will take in the future. The question now is not what happened here, it is what we do next. Because justice is never finished. It is a path we must keep walking, again and again." The crowd erupted into cheers once more, some crying, others embracing, all of them knowing they had lived through something that would outlast them. As Danielle looked down the trail, stretching endlessly ahead, she felt the weight of her scars ease into something else entirely. They were no longer just reminders of pain. They were proof that the path to justice had been walked, and that it would be walked again. And with the crowd beside her, Danielle stepped forward once more, ready for wherever the justice trail might lead.